Chainsaw Man chapter 144 just took my head and smashed it raw with no condom, because while I was expecting to see more devil hybrids from part 1 of the story to show up, I didn't have this in my surprise return for Bingo Book of Chainsaw Man 2023, which if you were one of the ones who predicted the return of Katana Man in this chapter specifically, congratulations, because you are a great prognosticator. However, with my initial thoughts out of the way, let's back things up and let's dive into the review itself. So the chapter opens up with the last one left off, where the Church of Chainsaw Man is looking to defend themselves against public safety, in particular Special Division 7, and in this one moment right here we see something rather interesting, which is, for as much chaos that the Church of Chainsaw Man has brought out in the series so far, like with us learning last chapter they carried out a mass shooting, you think that these kids be more comfortable holding a gun, but based off of some of the panels I saw, it did look like while they were trained to use guns, at least a couple of them looked like they were nervous, and it makes sense when you realize that these are just kids who've been misled and earn a way over their heads and are about to face the tall task of fighting off extremely experienced devil hunters and extremely powerful ones at that, which leads us to the moment you can see clear as day how in over their heads these kids actually are. One of the public safety devil hunters busts through the window and immediately begins to survey the situation, remarking their shock at how it's just kids in this area, and proceeds to start putting boots to asses, but begins to also lecture them on how kids should be holding pencils in their hands and not guns. Funniest thing of all, the fact that they were getting nailed to the wall after they got the weapons knocked out of their hands, and then they're getting lectured in the process of this, is both hilarious as well as make me wonder if this is Fujimoto doing what he did with the Gun Devil, where he previously made some subtle hints at his views on gun culture, and now we see one of the characters chastising kids for having guns in their hands and not having pencils. It's subtle, but it's just enough to the point that you get what he's saying, and given that Fujimoto is aware of his Western audience, I can't help but think that this might be another message sprinkled into this. That being said, while we don't actually learn the name of this devil hunter, and after seeing the actual design, which is really amazing, I really want to know more about the actual character we have. At first, I thought this might be Cosmo from part 1 of Chainsaw Man, just given that we saw Quancy in the last chapter. It made sense that you have Cosmo show up here, but I'm not too sure if this is actually Cosmo. That's why I want a little bit more clarification to learn more about the character we're seeing. Now, I could be wrong. The Cosmo Devil could have died, then it could have went down to hell, and then died again in hell, and ended up getting reborn on Earth and found a new body to make into a new fiend. And if that happens, I'll totally eat my words if that does end up being the case. And honestly, if this is the Cosmo Fiend, that's such a subtle nod, in my opinion, to Power and the Blood Devil that makes me continue to breathe a sigh of relief that Fujimoto hasn't forgotten about that promise that Denji made to Power in the last arc of part 1. I know that that's a plot thread that's going to get tied up eventually, and I might just be getting impatient because it is something I was looking forward to since the end of Chainsaw Man part 1. However, if this is the Cosmo Fiend, then it makes sense for the body to belong to Akane from part 1, just given the relationship with Katana Man in Chainsaw Man part 1. So it makes sense if you're going to bring back Katana Man, you might as well bring her back as a fiend as well, because these two, you kind of think of them like a duo. And if you want to keep playing with the Easter eggs, there's no bigger Easter egg in my opinion than reintroducing these two back into the story of part 2 for the first time, the same way we basically associated them as a duo when we first meet them in Chainsaw Man part 1, where they were seemingly always together for the most part. I can kind of see how the constant bringing back a character from Chainsaw Man part 1 into Chainsaw Man part 2 might be something that annoys some of you guys, but I actually enjoy it because it continues to serve as another connective tissue to Chainsaw Man part 1 that continues to reward long-term readers of the series and show that even though Asa Mitaka has been introduced as a main character in part 2, the events of part 1 are still very much so one of the engines driving the story forward. However, in typical Chainsaw Man fashion, things get really wacky immediately afterwards, because that devil hunter slash fiend just starts mauling the kid they're speaking to because they're not using proper etiquette, and then ends up getting into a fight with the next devil that shows up, which leads to Katana Man making his debut, saying the hell with justice once this devil starts going on about justice. And you see Katana Man saying there's no such thing as justice with Chainsaw Man as far as they're concerned. The return of Katana Man is really interesting when we sit down and we think about it, because obviously in part 1 of the story he was an antagonist, and the dude who literally shoots at Denji and company in part 1. He actually ends up hitting one of them. If I'm not mistaken, he ends up shooting Aki, and he tried to kill Denji in part 1. I think we all can agree that it's pretty telling that public safety has resulted to employing someone like Katana Man, who previously raised arms against Denji and Aki, and that was one of the more violent antagonists that we had in the first part of the series, which says to me that this threat of the Chainsman Church is a lot bigger than we might have initially thought. And we can see that with Katana Man, there's clearly no love lost between himself and Denji, which makes me wonder how public safety even managed to get him to agree to come on board to work for them. There's clearly a story here, and we obviously don't have all the details. He just came back, and hopefully this is something that gets addressed in the near future. Even if this is another situation like we saw with Denji and Power with the character Makima, where Makima is basically going, you carry out my orders or you die. I think it's worth dropping a quick line in there if this does end up being the case, especially if, say, it's a part of a plea agreement to avoid execution. We need just that little bit of context. Again, I can see why Fujimoto would just expect us to automatically assume this to be the case. That is a writing tactic to leave some things up to your reader's imagination. But first, with Kwanzi coming back and now Katana Man coming back, you'd hope to get some insight into what happened with these characters between Chainsman Part 1 and Chainsman Part 2, since they're back in the story and they seem to have a pretty decent role in the story so far, just given that they are helping break up this Chainsman Church plot. Even more important is this makes you wonder just what the interaction between Katana Man and Denji is going to be like, especially now that Denji can't transform into Chainsman again, and they're basically on the same team right now working for public safety. Even if Denji technically right now is on the sidelines being babysat by Fumiko and is getting watched, even if he's literally in the bathroom getting one off like we were told in the last chapter, just the prospect of seeing Denji and Katana Man interact again is so mouthwatering to me as a reader because of the potential it provides to us in the terms of conflict, just given the rather complicated history between these two characters. Think about it for a second. Katana Man hates Denji because he killed his grandpa, who was the debt collector that Denji ended up killing. He took his family from him, and in typical Japanese trope of blood revenge, where the son, or in this case the grandson, goes out for revenge that they set out to carry out on the person who took the relative from them. Basically typical samurai movie stuff, which is fitting since it's literally Katana Man who has swords at his disposal. However, now that Denji and him would be meeting under different circumstances, I'm so curious to see this because Denji and Aki, they weren't close enough when they fought against Katana Man to really be considered family. I think we could say that they were getting towards that relationship, but there was still some animosity between those two characters. However, Denji now has a literal family with Nayuta, which is part of the reason why I want to see these two interact again, just to see if Katana Man notices a change in Denji. This is actually a very underrated aspect of writing. One way that you can show a character's growth is by showing the readers how other characters perceive them. And there's enough rich history between these two characters that Fujimoto could actually cook up something pretty interesting. My only question about this chapter is, given all the characters we're seeing pop up, when is the second best girl Reze gonna show up in the series? Which I guess now that Makima's dead, I guess technically we have to call Reze the best girl. And then the next thing we have to wonder is, when is Fujimoto gonna start switching the story back over to Asa and Yoru? Don't get me wrong, I love when the story shifts over to Denji because Denji usually brings an element to chaos with, but all this violence and war against the Chainsman Church and the conflict that is happening makes me wonder if this actually has any impact on Yoru getting stronger, which we know for a fact is something that Fami actually wants. Which, that being said, I'm curious to know if you guys agree with me on whether or not this might be the Cosmo Fiend, and which hybrid do you think we'll see next.